Hello everyone, my name is Kason Quisenberry, and today I'm going to show you how to use global variables by using a game instance in Unreal Engine 5. Now, just to show an example of what I mean by global variables and how this can be useful. So here we have a simple game that I have where you have this character and they have a score on the top left, and then they collect these coins to get scores. So let's say that I have to have 300 points, right, in order to progress to the next level. So I go to the next level, and let's say I now need 600 points. Well, you might notice in the top left corner that my score reset. It was at 300, and now it went to 0, and now I have to recollect the coins to get that 300. So it's impossible for me to get a total of 600 because they did not transfer level to level. Now you might be wondering, why is this variable not transferring from level to level? Well, this variable, for example, is stored within our third-person character, so the player character, which is probably where a lot of your variables are stored. For example, your player health, your player, currency, your player score, or, more complex game, your player inventory is probably stored in your third-person character code. Now, this can be a problem because, as I showed, when you go to the next level, like when you go to another map, right, it resets the score. Now, why does it do this? Well, because it is not like you are moving your character from a certain vector point or a certain place in the world to another place in the world where your variables will stay the same. Instead, what is happening is that the original level is closing. And when it closes, it is actually unloading every single thing in this level, including the third-person character, right? So this third-person character stops being in memory. And then when it goes to the next level, it's not keeping this exact same instance of this character. Instead, it is basically creating a new character. So last character is our original character, and this is technically a different copy of the same character. So therefore, the score is going to reset because it's making a new character from scratch. So while the old character had 300 points, this character just started and therefore has 0. Now, this can also cause other issues potentially by putting all these variables in your third-person character. Say, for example, in our scoreboard, we are using our third-person character to get the score. Well, say that we get 200 points or whatever, and then our character dies. You'll notice the score goes to 0, right? Which doesn't make any sense because the score should still be at 200, but it can't access the third-person character because it doesn't exist. And if you hit escape, you'll see you're getting an error. Because since the third-person character does not exist, therefore it is no longer being loaded, and therefore you're going to get this error. Now, of course, in a death system, you don't have to actually destroy the player character, but this is just, a potential example. So if you have an actor that's holding a variable that is not always going to be in your game, not always going to be loaded into memory, or you're changing levels and you need a variable to stay, you need a global variable, which is going to be used via a game instance. And before we get into what a game instance is, I'm going to go over all the basic code that I have here. Again, my videos, you don't really have to follow along step by step, but if you're curious about all the code that I have currently and all the things I have, you can watch this. If you just want to learn about game instances, feel free to skip to the next chapter. But for those of you interested in the third-person character, all I'm doing is on event begin play, I am creating a score widget and I'm adding it to viewport. I then have this very simple level progression system where if I hit enter and I have 300 points, I open, my other level. But if I have 600 points, I open the original level. Speaking of levels, I have 2 levels, just the default third-person map, and then I have level 1, which is just a basic map with nothing in it. And so then I also have this backspace system just to destroy my actor. That's, represents death or whatever. I also have this variable here that is just an integer called score, and that's just representing the score. So that's in my third-person character as well. We then have this widget, which is just literally a text box in a canvas panel. And then as you can see here, I have a comment that says, don't do this. This is not good code. I kind of just set up this very simple system for the use of the video. But essentially on event tick, we're just going to update the text by setting it. Right now, which we'll change this in a bit, getting the player reference, and then getting the score variable I just talked about, and then appending it within this thing. And then we're getting a reference to our third-person character via our get player character. Again, I highly don't recommend doing it this way. It's better to use blueprint interfaces or event timers to update your UI rather than event tick, especially if you have a very complicated UI. But again, this is just, So I didn't have to actually code an entire widget. Finally, we have our coin, which is just a cylinder and a collision sphere. Then we have, again, getting our third person character. Just right now, we'll change that in a second. And then essentially if the player, which I have a tag player as well here called player, if the player enters, we're going to then add 100 to the score and then destroy the coin. Okay, now the first question you might be asking is, what is a game instance? Well, that's basically something that runs in the background every time you create a new instance of your game. And what an instance means is just every time you start the game, which is included in editor. So right here, if I hit play in the play in editor, otherwise known as Pi, I hit play. That has created an instance of the game. Like the second the game starts, it's there. It's always loaded into memory, which is very, very important, and I'll explain more about that later. And when you exit the game, that is the only time it ever stops working. So basically the entirety that your game is going, it is in the background. This also applies not just in editor, but also in your builds. So when you have, you boot up the executable, a game instance starts the moment you start the game. And the other thing that's important about that is it's the same game instance between level to level. So in my third person map, we have a game instance. And then I have all three of these. And then when I go to my next level, unlike the player character, which gets reset, like unloads a player character and loads a new one, the game instance stays the exact same. So it's not being unloaded or not being destroyed when you change levels, which is very useful for what we're going to do. The entire time you've been using Unreal, there's been a game instance. You just didn't know about it. So the way that you find the game instance is you go to project settings. Just go ahead and type in here game inst, and you'll find right here our game instance and our game instance class, and it's under project maps and modes if you want to find it normal way. But this is here. So this is just the default game instance that is with every Unreal project if you don't change it. And if we hit this to view the asset, you'll notice it doesn't take us anywhere. It takes us just to the last place that we were in, like the last place we were in our content browser. So basically, you can't edit this version, to my knowledge. I've never seen anyone edit this one or even be able to open the default game instance because I think it's just baked into Unreal. So the way that you can edit your game instance is by creating a new one. Now, I like to make a new folder for this inside a Blueprint. So just call it the game inst. Right, and then set it to whatever color you want. All right, so now what we do is we hit right click, and then we go to Blueprint class, and then we just type in game instance, and then you're going to click on this one. Don't click on platform game instance. That's incorrect. It's this one. So we then select that, and that is now our game instance. Now, the naming convention for this one is that you do GI, which stands for game instance underscore, and then you can put the name of your game. That's typically what I like to do, or you could put the name of the project, or you could just put, whatever. But it can't be named game instance since that already exists. So I guess you could call it game instance 1 if you want, but I like to call it GI and I'll just call it game right now. So this is our game instance. So if we open it up, you will see that it is just like a blueprint. We have the My Blueprint section with functions and variables and dispatchers and stuff like that. And we also have our details panel. However, very important to note, this is not in use. Just because you made it does not mean it's in use. We have to, again, go back to our project settings under game instance, right here, game instance class, and change this to GI underscore game. And then you're going to want to save. But this is a very, very important step right here to do this. All right, so now we have this. So we then want to make it to where our score is a global variable. That way it carries between levels. And that way, if our character needs to be unloaded for some reason, it doesn't cause any errors. So how do we do this? The first thing to do is to go to variables, hit plus. We're just going to call this score, make it an integer, all that good stuff. So that variable is now within our game instance. And so then we're going to first go to our third person character. So we're obviously using this variable. So we're just going to go ahead and delete these here. We're also going to go to our score, and I'm just going to delete that there as well. So we're going to delete it in coin. That way we can just go ahead and delete this variable as a whole. So we don't need it anymore. So right up here on our event begin play, this is the default player character. That's why it looks slightly different. This is just the default code that's in Unreal. But after mapping, add mapping context, and before our add score widget code, I'm going to move this down here. I'm then going to get game instance right there. So that's going to get a reference to our game instance. But what's important to note is that you can't, just pull off of this and say score, right? Because this isn't actually getting the specific game instance, if that makes sense. This is it being named game instance, and also the thing that it is being created in called an instance kind of gets a little confusing. But essentially, it's like this. Like you have the get player character, right? That also exists that looks like this node, right? But this is not getting the actual specific instance of this character, right? That just gets a reference to the class as a whole. Similarly, this does not get a reference to this specific game instance, i.e. this start of the game. It only gets a reference to the game instance as a class. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, all you need to know is that you need to cast to the game instance to actually get access to that reference. So then we go here and we do cast to gi_game. And then I always make it a variable. I'd recommend doing that. It just makes sense. And I just call it the game instance right there. You can also call it, gi_ whatever as well. That's would make sense as well. Or just, whatever you want. I'm, not the node police. Anyways, now if you watched my last video about soft references that talks about memory, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So if you don't care about memory, just skip ahead a little bit. Since the game instance is always started when we press play on the game and does not get unloaded or does not get destroyed until the game is closed, it is always going to be loaded into memory no matter what. This means it is perfectly okay for our player character or multiple actors to have a reference to it because it's never going to cause extra memory to be loaded onto the game, because if the game instance isn't loaded onto memory, your game isn't going to work, right? Now, that being said, it is important not to overload your game instance by putting every single possible variable in there. Right? You should only put, key variables that you need to save or key variables that you want to be global. But if they're small variables that are very specific to the actor as a whole, or if it's just doesn't need to be passed on between, levels, it is perfectly okay to just have that within the character, right? I'm not saying you should replace every single variable with game instance variables, right? Because that can, that's one, just not very efficient, and two, can make your game instance take up a lot of memory, which I don't think that would cause too much problems. If your game instance is super bloated, it might just cause some initial lag when the game starts, like when it initially loads the game instance at the very beginning of the game. But I've never seen it happen before. Basically what I'm saying is be careful with this. Don't put every single variable. Kind of use common sense, and you can kind of gain comic sense just from experience of using it. So anyways, now we have our game instance. So now we can go here, get game instance, and then get our variable here. We can then get score. And so now we put that there. Again, if you want an explanation of all this code, I explained it in previous chapter. There we have that. So that's all working. And so what we then need to do is go into our score. And so now we can delete this third person character reference. We do not need that anymore, which again is good because that stops the error for when our player character is not loaded in. Our widget then will not be messed up. We're going to delete that variable, and we're going to instead get game instance. So as you can see, this basically replaces that code exactly. It's basically a more efficient substitution for just getting a player character reference. And so there we go. And then finally, we need to go to our coin. Again, just replace this code, and then you're set. All right, so now I've replaced that code. So now let's see what happens. So I then go to the next level, 300 points. Because again, that was stored in our game instance on our player character, which never changes. So now I can actually get the 600 points and go to the other level, which is just the same level because this is a YouTube video. And so there we have it. And then another thing, again, those three actors all would need to reference the player character, right? But if the player character doesn't exist, you'll notice the score stays the exact same. And when we get out of the game, there's no error. So that completely fixes the problem. So that fixes all of our issues because instead of using local variables stored just inside this, we're using global variables in our game instance. Also, technically, these are not global variables in traditional coding sense. I know probably a bunch of people will point that out and they might point that out. But this, I just like thinking of them as global variables because now these variables can be easily shared across every single blueprint in your project, right? So this doesn't have to just be for, this can be in your character, this can be in a widget, this can be in a generic actor, right? And it can be shared all across these three. All three of these can update that variable. It can also just get that variable, which is kind of what I wanted to show. So technically, again, not global variables in the traditional nerdy sense, but you can use them globally across your entire project, which is why I like to think of them as global variables. That's going to do it for this video. I hope that you learned how to create global variables in Unreal Engine 5. This is a shorter video than my normal. I think I'm going to start doing shorter videos because I want to make more videos. But just between work and some other side projects, it takes up a lot of my time. So hopefully I'll be able to make more videos like I said I was going to in my last video, just by making shorter, more condensed, more rapid fire, stuff like that. So I hope that you guys will enjoy that. So I guess keep your eyes open for new videos if that's something you're interested in, and keep making games in Unreal. Bye guys.